Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Katrina LeMay-Doan, President and CEO of Sport Calgary, and welcome to our grant writing webinar. Before we start, I want to acknowledge, in the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, the Métis Nation Region 3, and all the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. So thanks for joining us. I know this is a topic that many of Sport Calgary members have requested, have wanted. We get lots of questions about grants. And so we thought, let's host this webinar. Again, it will be a conversation talking about what grant writing is, some of the questions. And then on April 22nd, that is a Friday at 9 a.m. at Repsol, we are going to be having a workshop. So Sara Stepa, one of the guests of today, will be running that workshop. So that will be in person. So for those Sport Calgary members, it is free. And for more information on Sport Calgary membership, which is also free, just let us know at the end of this, and my colleague Sandra can reach out to you. So today was a great celebration, actually, March 29th. I just came back from City Council, where it was proclaimed that today is Olympian and Paralympian Salute Day. So members of Calgary-based Olympic and Paralympic team were down at City Hall, and all the members of the team were acknowledged. And I will say that I pushed the message of sport, because we need to make sure that sport is part of our recovery. Coming out of the pandemic, we need sport to make us a healthy community. But if sport doesn't have any money, sport won't exist. So that's why we're doing this. So let me introduce our guests. So if both Sarahs could come up on camera, that would be great. And it's easy for me because they're both Sara. They're both Sara S, actually. So we're going to start with Sara Stepa. She's been raising funds for personal and community causes for over a decade. In her previous role as the Director of Programs at Parks Foundation Calgary, she learned the ins and outs of both sides of the grant pipeline before starting her own grant writing business in 2021, which is called Step Up Consulting. Sara's passion lies in supporting small to medium-sized nonprofits and charities, and using a capacity-building lens, she hopes to relieve the burden of under-resourced organizations, because we have a few of those, and help build the skills and knowledge needed across the sector. Throughout her career, she has personally secured over $1 million in grant, and with her guidance, an additional approximately $3.5 million has been successfully secured by partner organizations and projects. So Sara Stepa, thanks for joining us. Next, we have Sara Salas, Manager of Programs and Development at Parks Foundation Calgary. So Sara has raised millions of dollars in grant funding for nonprofit organizations over the course of her career. She understands the unique mix of elements required to develop a successful grant application. Having worked on both sides of grants, Sara will share her insights and expertise to help organizations strengthen their applications and build their own grant writing skills. So as I mentioned, she's currently the Manager of Programs and Development at Parks Foundation Calgary. Her 20-year career includes leadership roles in communication, fundraising, and sports in the UK and Canada. And she's passionate about supporting communities to live healthy, active lives. So Sara Salas, thank you for joining us. We have a number of organizations who have registered today, and this is being recorded. It will be available for members once we are finished and uploaded to our site. As I said earlier, as soon as you say grant writing, I'm going to tell you, like, I break out into a sweat, because I just instantly, it's something I don't understand. I feel lost. I don't know where to go. And I guess my first question is, is it something that's, I don't even want to say, is it intimidating? Because it is intimidating for a lot of organizations, especially maybe even small organizations who are doing a lot of that stuff. But, sort of why is the concept of applying for a grant so intimidating? especially when we talk about small organizations, what's the experience that you guys have had? And I'm just going to put it out there, and both of you can take it and comment and go wherever.
Well, I can go first. I think it is a really scary and intimidating process if you're not used to applying for a grant. When you first look at an application, there's a lot of information to wade through, and there's the guidelines, and so it is hard to know where to start. And I think really there are some tools you can have at your disposal to help you. It's once you get started working on grants, you'll develop your skills in grant writing. There are resources out there that can help you as well. So I think the one of the first tips I would just say is to give yourself enough time when you're applying. Find out when the application deadlines are, and give yourself enough time if it's your first time around. I'll pass to Sara Stepa because I'm sure she has some good tips as well.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to chuckle all day that we have the same name. Anyway. I would just note that generally the first grant that you write is always going to feel like the hardest, whether it's the first grant from your organization or the first grant on a particular project, because you're really trying to iron out what the story is, what the impact is, and how it aligns with the funder. And so being able to simplify and really understand what you are trying to do will make it easier to write the grant. So instead of starting with the grant, start with what you're trying to achieve and kind of work up from there, because that'll take a little bit of the intimidation factor out, because you're focused on your mission, your impact, rather than all these crazy questions and supporting documents that a grantor is looking for. But it does definitely get easier over time.
So Sara Salas, you did mention, there are places where you can sort of find out some tips. Can you tell us where? Because we'll talk again where sort of to find grants, but the tips on some of these things, which goes into a lot of our questions from people who are a part of this. Where would people find these tips?
So there's lots and lots of tips online for a start. Like if you Google grant writing tips, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of pages of tips. So I think there's some great resources. Some are better than others, so you'll kind of get a feel for which are better. You've got resources as well, like Sara Stepa. She assists organizations with grant writing. So then you've got professional support for somebody who is offering that service. I would say the other thing is you can reach out to the grantor directly. So when we have our grants, we encourage applicants to actually contact us. And we can discuss the application, discuss whether the project is eligible, and provide any kind of tips and hints we can. So it's kind of a process of learning as you go. The more grants you apply for, the more you'll learn sort of where to look for information and what resources you have.
So that surprises me. I don't know if it would surprise a lot of people, but I would think yes, because my original guess would have been that people think if they reach out to those who are giving the grant, that it's not necessarily that, oh, okay, you're going to flag us being great, we're communicating, you're going to flag us because we don't necessarily know what we're doing, but know what we're asking for. So that is always a good thing to reach out.
So not every grantor will respond. So if you're applying, for instance, for a federal or a provincial grant, you may have a harder time reaching a contact because they deal with much larger sums of money in granting. But if you reach out to Parks Foundation, I know that with someone like the Calgary Foundation as well, their staff are often very willing to have a conversation. So we prefer it if applicants reach out to us to discuss eligibility and their application before they apply.
Okay, that's great. Very good sort of even starting information. I want to go to some of the questions that were submitted, because these are, and they're sort of all over the place, which is great. And again, I want to remind everybody that you can bring these questions, you can bring, it'd be one-on-one or in a in-person setting on the 22nd of April. So that might be very beneficial for a lot of people. Giving yourself time. And thank you, Sandra, my colleague, who is putting some links and also information on the chat. Again, these are going to be available. But one of the questions, which I think is very key, get enough time, but what do you need to have in place before you begin writing a grant?
I can jump in. So each funder will be a little bit different, but some of the basics I would say is have a fulsome idea of what your program or project is and what you need funding for. It sounds really straightforward, but you would be surprised that people start looking for funds and looking for applications before they really know what they need. So again, starting with what your program project is and what you're trying to achieve in sport, in community, with youth, whatever that looks like, whatever area, and getting clear on what that is for your organization. And then how much money do you need to make that happen? So a budget is another piece that groups will look at a funder and say, oh, I can ask for 25,000. Oh, that means we have to spend 25,000, or we have to ask for 25. You don't always have to ask for the same or the full amount that they can give you. Obviously you want it if you can utilize it, but don't force yourself to create expenses that fit into a budget that you don't need. And so definitely figuring out how much your total project is, and then what grants can fit into that. So most funders will not fund a project in full. So keeping that in mind, that you might need various funders, you might need some internal funding or other individual donations, but the full project scope and expenses that are associated with that, start thinking about those, because you're definitely going to need them when you work through an application. And depending on the funder, the specifics will vary on how detailed you need to go, but at least if you've kind of started to think about it, you might even know some vendors you're going to reach out to. Then you have those pieces in place before you're scrambling to fill in a budget template. So those are a couple of things I would say.
Anything to add to that? Other Sarah? I'll just keep saying other Sarah.
In terms of, other Sarah. I think that, I would completely agree with all of that. I would say, really have a sort of some clear idea of how you're going to position your project. So kind of have sort of almost like a statement of impact ready, so that you know exactly how to describe your project before you start applying, similar to what Sara Stepa was saying. And I would say, I'm not sure whether I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but also when you're looking at grants, really try to understand the grantor that you're applying to, because every grantor is slightly different, has slightly different priorities and things that they're looking for. So I could be jumping ahead, like I said here, but make sure you do your research about the grantor that you're actually applying to. And there's ways that you can do that to find out a bit more about them.
So that actually goes to one of the questions, which I think is probably a lot of people's questions when they look at grants that are available. How do you actually decide if the grant opportunity fits your organization? And if you're unclear, as you said, you could maybe contact them, but is it worth going through this process just to try it? Or, sort of a two-part question, but I'm sure that's relevant to a lot of organizations.
I would say start by obviously reading through everything. Make sure that you read the guidelines for the grant application and read all of the information that you can get about the grant before you contact the funder. You don't necessarily want to be asking questions that are already available online, but you can find information. You can also read about the organization. Which projects have they funded in the past? What has been their average grant size they've given? So a lot of that information is available online. You can look at what the organization's priorities are. Do they mention they have certain pillars of priorities that they're looking to fund? So you can find out that. And then I would say, by all means, contact the grantor and ask if your project is in line with the priorities of the organization before you apply.
Yeah, I would really emphasize the conversation with the funder. It might be challenging to get in touch with some of the larger foundations or corporate groups, or depending, but it is really, really beneficial, because it does tell you if you're in line with the funder. And sometimes grantors, they use some jargon that might not be super easy to understand. So that's when you're like, I don't know if I fit, and having the conversation is super beneficial. So if you can, like, it is worth the effort, try to call them, send multiple emails, follow up. Of course, that can take time. So again, if you only have 2 weeks before a deadline, this could be challenging, and funders usually are really busy around their deadlines. But it's really worth it to then get an understanding of how you can even tweak your project or tweak your program to align with those funder priorities that Sarah just mentioned. And then that's going to help you stand out when they're reviewing, because you have direct alignment. And to the question, Katrina, around is it worth applying? Grants can take a lot of time and a lot of effort. And I personally don't recommend groups just applying for everything under the sun. I think it's much more important to be focused and intentional about where you put your time and effort, because there's so many opportunities out there, and you can try and force a peg into a round hole. But if you don't have the time, if you're a small organization, if you're volunteers, manage your time accordingly, because you don't want to burn out or lose your passion or put in low quality requests or applications, because then again, you're doing yourself a disservice and you're unlikely to get funded. So managing your time and finding and having those conversations to ensure you're applying for ones that you are eligible for and that are aligned with what you're doing will pay off down the line.
Okay, before I get to the other questions that were pre-submitted, I'm going to go to a couple that have been sent. You talk about budget and know your budget. What about situations where there might be some work in kind? I think that's sort of, I'm getting the gist of the question, putting that in the budget. And I mean, obviously, you don't know the exact numbers, especially with things changing day by day right now. Just if you could give a little more guidance about how to do those budgets, and again, in-kind work and how those are worked into it.
I think most funders are aware, like we're aware, that project budgets can change. So when we start out working with an organization, we're aware that there can be some changes. We would look for minimal changes rather than huge changes. So I would say, certainly include your in-kind expenses. I know on most grant application forms, they'll give you space to list your in-kind expenses. So make sure that you give as close to an accurate version of the expenses that you can for your project. And I would say, if your project does change after your budget does change after you receive the funding, just keep in touch with your grantor about any potential changes. Like I said, there's always a bit of wiggle room for, there's some minor changes. It's really when there's a really big change that can be a bit of a challenge for us as a funder. So, yeah.
Can you give maybe even example of what is the thing you see for in-kind budgeting? Is there something that you see the most of or most common, or no? Is it big variety?
For us, it's typically not so much on the sports projects. I would say more on the park and playground projects, where we see in-kind donations, things like landscaping and sort of the vendors who are building the parks will provide an in-kind. But we do see in-kind contributions of all. It could be volunteer time to assemble something, or volunteer time to come and clear an ice rink or something like that. So we see all kinds of examples.
And I think that's important because, especially in the sport world, some of the items that would be in kind, we just don't even think about. But to mark those down as in-kind contribution, I think that's really important. So that's why I just kind of wanted some examples. Have people start thinking. And again, it's sharing with other organizations, how they do things, what they mark as in kind, because it's a different, if you haven't done a lot of grant writing, it's a different way of thinking. So that's why I just sort of wanted, even that might sort of spur some, oh yeah, we do have people doing that. That could be an in-kind.
I think it's a good point, Katrina, that you say to have conversations with other groups to see what they're doing and how they're doing it. Because even when you're building your budget, you might have a program that you're trying to do that's new for your organization, but there's likely other groups that have done something similar or have run programs for youth or sport or whatever that looks like. So if you're not sure what the value might be to rent a facility, go talk to some groups that have done that, or do a little bit of research to build that up. And then for in-kind opportunities, like they can be even web development, marketing, communications, design work. There's a lot of things that there's so many talented people that are volunteering in these amazing spaces that have their day jobs, that they're professionals, and variety of ways. Even accounting could be an area of in-kind. But when you're applying, you have to again look at the funder and what they recognize as in-kind, what they recognize as expenses or ineligible expenses. So a lot of them will say professional fees aren't accepted or fundraising fees aren't accepted. So then those in-kind wouldn't be accepted as well. So looking at the specifics of that will be important too.
Okay, that's great. There's another question about, in order to get a project up and running, what if you were going to be needing multiple funding sources and grants? How do you work through that? What's sort of the strategy there and how to deal?
So I'd say it's challenging when you're going to need multiple grants, because most funders don't like to be first funds in. Grantors, funders, they're not super excited because they want to ensure that your project is sustainable, it's going to happen, and that it's a viable program or project. And so they usually look for other fundraising to kind of start the process. So that might be individuals, AGLC funds, maybe a small business. In-kind can also be that starting point if it's a big ticket item, like the city of Calgary does. It is quite significant in relation to the park and playground area. But yeah, the first funds can be challenging, and that helps when you talk to funders as well to explain, okay, we're doing this grant, this grant, this grant, and having a plan for where you're going to get the funds. And I do not recommend having grants as your only source of funding. If you have just 5 grants listed, that's going to fund everything. You're probably not going to get approved for all 5 of those grants. So every funder will ask you, okay, so what's your plan if this one doesn't come through? What's your plan if this one doesn't come through? So when you have fundraising events, AGLC funds, when you have a variety, again, it gives a little bit more confidence to the funder that your project is going to happen. Be creative in where you find funds. Grants aren't the only way to find funding.
And fundraising outside of grants can be challenging. So, sometimes we will have groups reach out to us and say, how can I fundraise? And so, there are other ways of fundraising in your community. And obviously that is a different skill set that most people don't have, but it is possible to fundraise with some fairly simple ideas. And as Sarah said, it does help to show that your community organization or your group is making a bit of an effort outside of just grant funding.
Yeah, being creative, I think, is a key word. I laugh when you say there's other ways to get money. It's like, oh, when you find that tree, let us all know, because we will all be running to it and replanting it. So, especially in sport right now.
Yeah.
Some of the questions are about grants and if they involve kids, projects that involve kids. Is it different if it's kids versus adults, or is there? So can you guide us through some of the points through that?
I think a lot of the sports projects do tend to involve children. However, I know that that there is a big push for sort of more equitable distribution of grant funds. So we are looking for projects where it's adult focused. Even seniors would be great to see more projects for seniors. I think it just typically the amateur sports field, it tends to include children typically, I would say. But there's no reason, we personally, for our grants, we wouldn't prioritize sports focusing on children over adults.
Yeah, and I'd say it's just specific to the funder, again, reading those guidelines and what that funder's priority or mandate is. If they have a youth focused mandate and you're applying for adult sport, it's not in alignment. I'd like to be very black and white, but being able to find those opportunities when it's described more broadly, then adults could be in there, seniors could come in there. But if it does specify youth, then I wouldn't push it. That said, sometimes youth is actually defined as up to age. I've seen up to age 21. I've seen it up to age 35. So defining what youth means to a funder is also a good question to ask.
And I think, you know, as we talk about whether it's youth, adult, you know, and seniors, now we talk about the inclusion side. And I know Karen is on from the Calgary Adapted Hub. And if people are applying for grants, is that part of the creative side about, you know, if I have a program, but actually maybe this program could include some programming that could be adaptable and be more inclusive? Is that, how do I say it other than saying, is that actually looked favorably within a grant application?
I think again, it depends on the funder. And so back to that point of really looking at what the funder is looking for. You know, certainly inclusivity is an area that we look for in all of our projects that we provide grant funding for. It wouldn't necessarily preclude a community from a group from receiving funding, but we certainly look for inclusive aspects and those sort of more unique projects that are including a wider range of ages and that type of thing.
Yeah, I think there's opportunity for it to be a little bit of interest to a funder, because it opens the program to more individuals, so the impact is higher. So it's not just the, you know, kind of jumping on the, oh, this is an inclusive project, but it's also about more people are actually being included now. And for most grantors, that is a priority, is highest impact, most number of participants, reaching the most number of people. So I think it's a very positive aspect to be able to highlight or show that it can be adaptable, or more people can come and participate.
And I think the key is, again, we want all these organizations to have an impact in our community, right? So I think, you know, I love the idea. And already, honestly, even though I'm not the one writing grants, I feel better, because as soon as you say, have a plan, but then know the project, but what's the impact that you want to have? And so sometimes, you know, we just think too quickly about, okay, what are we going to do? Let's look at that. What do we want to accomplish? So between there, yes, that's the difficult work, which is the actual content, which comes to quite a few questions that we've been asked. Are there actual real do's and are there real don'ts? And I know that's very broad, but perhaps from some applications, grants that you've seen, really what's a red flag, and maybe even like a green flag?
My goodness, there's so many answers to this question.
There are
some highlights, and because I think people, it's giving the examples, like I was asking about, you know, the in-kind. As soon as we give some examples, it allows some people to relate and go, okay, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I can go first, Sarah, if you want to take a sec to get your brain thinking. I have a couple of favorite do's when I'm writing grants. So in my grant writing business, I'm working with a lot of groups, and of course, there's a lot of sharing of information. And so a lot of funders use online portals that don't allow you to spell check, or that allow you to save your progress. So I always recommend using a separate document, Word, just simple, to be simple, that allows you to share with your team or share with an external partner, so you can work together. When you're working solo on an application, you're likely not going to make it the strongest it can be. So working in a team and being able to work on a document together is really, really helpful. And I would highly recommend it. I'd also recommend saving your application. Again, seems like a simple thing, but save all the documents, all the information you submit to a funder, because as Sarah mentioned earlier, sometimes your project changes. Budgets change, designs change, focuses change, because sometimes funding from the time you apply to when you hear back could be 6 months. And so reminding yourself of, what did I tell this funder 6 months ago? You're likely going to forget. So save everything that you submit, print everything, because again, online portals, you're not always able to go back to the portal. And usually they tell you when you submit. So keeping that information is really important. And then a couple of my don'ts would be, Again, sounds super simple. Don't submit an incomplete application. As a reviewer of a funder, you start going through them and you see this is missing, this is missing, this is missing. It's a little bit frustrating because it's especially when the guidelines are quite clear, because you are making it difficult for the funder to approve you. And now they're focused on what's missing and not on the impact, not on what you're trying to do. And so that's a little bit unfortunate. Of course, funders are great. I know Parks Foundation is fantastic at following up and helping groups that might not know how to complete their budget or might not know what their annual return is. So asking questions is not a negative, but trying your best to submit a complete application is really important, especially when you go to the provincial or federal level, because they get hundreds. So don't make your application get put to the bottom because it's incomplete or even just kicked out. Sometimes they just say incomplete. It's just, no, you're not eligible. You're done. You don't get a second shot. So, and then one final thing I'll say for a don't is if your application fails, don't assume that it's because your project wasn't good or that your program isn't valuable. Sometimes it wasn't a good fit. Sometimes it's just a highly competitive round of funding, or, you know, maybe it's just, there's some work to do on the application. So again, if you have a contact following up with organizations, I know Parks Foundation does it, Calgary Foundation does it, when you can have a conversation to say, why wasn't it funded? And then you can gain a little bit more clarity, whether it's about how you wrote the application or about your program specifically. And then you can think about that, take it back, learn through the process.
Super useful. Thank you.
Those are great tips. A couple of do's I would add. And really the first is reiterating what Sarah said, but one of the things I noticed with some of our grant applications, and maybe it's because the process is overwhelming and maybe, you know, the people writing the grants aren't experienced with writing, but often people overlook just writing really clearly and concisely about what their project is. So when you apply for a grant like the Calgary Foundation's grant, Sarah said they actually give you, it's on an online form, you have a limited number of words you can use. And I think that's intentional because grantors want you to be really concise about what you're asking for. They don't want to read, you know, 3 pages and then finally in the last paragraph you get down to what the project is actually about. So really think about how you can be really clear and really concise when you're writing your project descriptions and the impact statements and that type of thing, because again, going back to that thing of make it easy for the grantor to understand what your project is, why it's needed, what impact it's going to have. I can't stress that enough. It sounds like a very simple thing, but often I think applicants kind of get tied up in doing a big long explanation and all the details and all of that. So I keep it concise. And my second do is would be to have someone else proof check. I really like Sarah's idea of, you know, save your application in a Word file if you're adding it into a template. Have someone else proof check. I do that for literally every single thing I write. If I'm doing a grant application, I'll have at least one other person proof check what I've written and ask them for honest feedback. Does it make sense? Have I put everything in the right order? If I've written 3 paragraphs, are those paragraphs in the right, like, will the grantor get the right impression right off the bat? Are there things that I've missed? Are there spelling mistakes? That type of thing. So I would highly encourage you to get, it doesn't have to be a professional proofreader. It can just be someone else in your office. It can be your roommate, your husband, someone else. And I guess just as for the don'ts, it just relates back to my first point, which was like, don't make it too complicated. If it becomes too complicated, it adds work for the grantor, and that could impact your chances of getting the grant.
Great points. Thank you so much. We've all read those documents where we zone out at one point because there's so much information, and then, oh, that's what the point they wanted to make, which is what you're saying. Be concise, be clear. But one of the questions then is, if you have a bunch of applications and they're all clear and they're all concise, is there something that can make your grant sort of shine over somebody else's?
What do you think, Sarah? Do you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure. I think it's really about sharing the story from your unique lens. Why is your program different than everyone else's? So then you do stand out from the pack. So if we're using sport as an example, and all youth programs, various sports, the pieces that make you stand out might be that inclusivity aspect. It might be longevity, sustainability. It might be innovation, doing something differently. And so again, when you're thinking about your program, project, sport, what you're trying to do, thinking about that impact and how you're doing it differently. There are thousands of nonprofits, thousands of charities applying for these funds, and there's a lot of people doing the same thing. So it's how do you show that you're doing it differently? And funders love collaboration. So if you're partnering with groups, that can also help you stand out a little bit as well. So you're not duplicating things over and over again.
Okay.
And I would just add to that, think about how you're sort of selling your story in your grant application. Think about, I mean, we talk about storytelling with grant applications because there has to be a little bit of emotion and a little bit of fact in your application. So some applicants will use a lot of facts to demonstrate why their project is unique. We have 20,000 people wanting to access this program, and then they leave out the kind of the emotional side. And some applicants will write purely from the heart. You know, this is really needed because, you know, we have X number of people who, you know, or just kind of from the perspective of one individual, perhaps. So I would just suggest when you're writing your grant, include a little bit of pulling at the heartstrings and then the fact side of things as well to back up what you're saying. And that is a little bit of a skill developing that. And so I would say just try to include a bit of both of those sides if you can.
Yeah, great information. And I think that comes back to then the collaboration between if it's somebody else who wants to review it and has a different perspective, and maybe even for some of these smaller sport organizations is talking to a member or a parent or somebody, getting something that's made an impact. Maybe a statement like that could go a long way. And so I think that's really great, just because it's going to allow everybody, you know, to tell their story. And that's what we don't do well enough, is to tell our own story. What makes our organization unique and what impact can you have on the community? So,
and you raise a really good point. Sorry, just before you go on there, Catriona, you raised a really good point about actually finding someone who would be the end user of the project, because you can often submit letters of support, for instance, and we really like to see letters of support, and funders do. And so often when applicants are putting in their applications, they'll include letters of support from government, so politicians, councillors. But it's also really nice when you can see letters of support from the community members who are going to actually benefit from the program that you're applying for. So if you do find a parent or somebody who's going to use the equipment you're applying for or the facility that you're upgrading, ask them to write a letter of support and say that, you know, they're a community member and they need it, and this is why. That can help. So
are there too many? Can you have too many letters of support? I mean, is there a proper number?
Typically we'll get three maybe letters of support. It can really help if you can have a few more.
Okay, that's good to know. Great tips, thank you. And you just brought up actually facility. So a few of our questions are regarding, you know, we've talked about programs, different, again, whether it's capital or programming, and what if it's a bit of both? Can you sort of touch on that? If a project is going to need both the capital side and the programming side?
You need to find those special funders that fund both.
Yeah.
No, so like I would say generally funders kind of pick one or the other.
Okay.
But there are going to be instances that, again, looking at eligible expenses, and when you're looking at programming, it might be staff, facility, And then there might be an opportunity where you need equipment, you need some of those things. And a good, this is a whole other conversation, but a good funder understands that you can't just necessarily run a program without new equipment. You're trying to expand, you're trying to grow, you need some additional pieces. So again, having those conversations is great to explain why you need these things. And if they're eligible, apply for all of it under the sun. I know Parks Foundation's amateur sport is capital specific. So reading the guidelines to ensure you're not applying for ineligible pieces is really important.
You guys mentioned earlier about if you get denied by a grant. It's not necessarily that it was bad or anything. Can you keep reapplying, or does that, and I mean, let's say it's even my larger one, or even if it's a smaller, if it says Parks Foundation and you do talk to Parks Foundation, keep applying for the same grant. Is that recommended, sort of frowned upon? Do you wait a certain amount of time?
We usually recommend that, you can reapply, but if you've been turned down, just reach out to us again. Sometimes we have applicants who applied, were unsuccessful, applied right away again in the next round. And so again, just reach out to us and check for eligibility.
Yeah, I would recommend that as well. Don't just reapply to reapply, because there's a reason without knowing why you weren't funded. Know the reason why you weren't funded before you go again, because if you just resubmit the same application, people are like, oh, we already saw this. And X, Y, and Z was not in alignment. So know why you weren't funded. And if you can't get a hold of an organization, then really think about, is it worth the investment? Because just submitting the exact same application is likely going to give you the same result.
Okay, great. A lot of questions are about, and we talked about this earlier, where do you find grants? Because it's overwhelming. So if an organization, and a lot of our organizations, a lot of our members are all volunteer run. People, especially just coming out of the pandemic, I mean, people are overwhelmed, they're busy, how do you find information?
Well, Sport Calgary is a really great resource. So shout out to Sandra, who does a lot of background work in looking up grants in the sport realm for the Sport Calgary members. I know I am on the member bulletin as well as the newsletter list, and there's always a section about grants that are coming up and that are available. And for myself, running my own grant writing business, I actually don't spend a lot of time on Google personally, because I find it quite challenging to find specifics. And so a lot of newsletters are actually really helpful. So mention Sport Calgary. CCVO is also a newsletter that submits or sends out some funding opportunities. They're not all sport related, but even knowing what's out there can be helpful. And then also at the Calgary Library, you can access a program called Grant Connect, which is a place where you can go and you can access thousands and thousands of grants and funders and kind of filter between different specifics and eligibility. So if you're a nonprofit, which most sport organizations are, not charities, then you're able to filter in that way. So then you're not reading a grant and say, oh, we're not eligible because we're not a charity. So some of those would be good resources. I love newsletters because scouring the internet is very time consuming. And like you said, you don't have a lot of time to do those things. So
I'd also say on that, the Grant Connect is a really good resource. And so, you can go to the library to access that. When we talk about alternative ways to fundraise, when you go onto that, as Sarah said, you can actually filter your search. So you can find funders and grantors who give to sports projects or give to, youth or whatever your area is that you're applying for. And you may even come across some funders or some foundations, and even reach out to those organizations and ask them about funding, because sometimes you can connect with a foundation or a donor who might be interested in your project specifically. So if you don't reach out, you don't find out. They don't necessarily, some of them may not have another grant application intake for another year, but reach out to them and find out.
Yeah, great. And thank you, Sandra. Sandra has put a lot of the links
Mhm.
on the chat. And I believe right at the beginning, Sara Stepa, we put your LinkedIn, which you also list a lot of grants. So thank you for that. And again, all the information will be sent to everybody. And this webinar is being recorded. So I think, I'm going to give each of you just any sort of closing thoughts, because there's a lot of information, but what I love is that you made it simple, because it's about telling your story and it's about the impact you want to have. Yes, it's the content that is difficult, but which is why then we want to follow this up with the workshop, being able to actually, take these ideas, take what is being suggested, and learn how to actually put that through the process, because we want everybody to succeed. There's money out there, and we need to make sure and get that money so that we can have that impact community. So Sara Salas, I'll turn to you. Any closing thoughts?
Sure. Just a couple of other things. Funders do like to be recognized. So think about that when you're applying. Just one other tip, we, especially for sports projects, Parks Foundation is looking for recognition. Things like putting the logo on basketballs or sports courts, sales for your boats, that type of thing. Anything like that can be helpful for us to know if we are going to receive recognition. And then the other thing I was just going to mention is really make sure that you provide a good follow-up report. I think it's a lot of work goes into the application, and a lot of the focus goes into that. And then once you've received the money, and you're doing your project, you kind of get tied up in that. But really make sure that you always provide a really strong report. So I would say go over and above to provide a report for your grantors, because you may want to apply to them again for funding down the line. Like we accept repeat applications. And so when you're doing your report, try and get some testimonials, some stories from the people that have used the program, get some really good pictures. And if you've got a picture with the funder's logo on there, provide those. Invite your funder out to, if you're having an opening ceremony or that type of thing. So those can be helpful as well. So yeah, those are just an extra couple of tips there.
Yeah, great suggestions.
Yeah, definitely really important aspects, Sara, for sure, for sure. A couple of things I would just, I guess, emphasize is, again, focusing on why you're doing this and why you need the funding. Because I think writing grant applications becomes overwhelming because we haven't thought through all of those steps. So when you see a question of what's your impact, you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know. But if you spend the time within your team to say, we're doing this for this reason, we're doing this event, this program, and really connecting to the outcome, the why, the impact, then the questions become a little bit easier. The more details you know about your application or your program before you start writing, the easier they will be. Because for myself, like working with my clients in the grant writing field, oftentimes they have a really good idea of the broad program project that they're trying to do. But then we start going to specifics and they realize they don't know what the timeline is. They don't realize how much they need. They don't realize what the concrete outcomes are. And that's when they start to spiral a little bit, because you're usually on a timeline. Oh, the deadline's in 2 weeks. We have to come up with this stuff really quickly. So once you're really clear, you could even create a one-pager summary of like a fact sheet. Would be a really helpful resource. And then you can pull those facts for applications as they apply to each question. And so then you're keeping your message consistent and you're not going all over the place and being swayed by a funder, but you're keeping true to what your project is and why you're doing it in the first place. And I will give myself a little bit of a plug. If you do need extra support, guidance, I take, free 30-minute calls just to have a quick chat. I believe Sandra's going to be sending out some information as well to connect with me. But if you're looking for additional support, I do have writing services, critique services to help provide some feedback for you, depending on where you're at and what needs are. So that is an opportunity. You can connect with me through LinkedIn or whatnot, but asking for support is really positive. Doesn't have to be me as well. It can be Sara Salas at Parks Foundation. There's lots of groups that offer free support, free guidance, looking online, it depends on what specific level you need, but I'm happy to help if you're looking to, resource a little bit of extra outsourcing. So.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. And again, that's a reminder about the workshop. So Sara Stepa will be running on April 22nd at Repsol in person. Just before we close up, I'm putting on my glasses just to read the chat. A couple of quick questions. Sara Salas, you talked about acknowledging the funder, so probably important to send a thank you note. Probably wouldn't go, it would go a little ways on that. Time frame typical on an application. So I'm not quite sure if that's referring to how long it takes to apply or how long it takes to hear from, but is there sort of a general timeline?
Yeah, it very much depends on who you're applying to. At Parks Foundation, from when we received the application, we do say that it's about a 3-month turnaround time. However, we strive to, turn around our decisions within about two and a half months. Again, it very much depends. So you have to check with the funder again when you can expect to hear back.
Okay. And then one quick question, just following up, with regards to even when you're saying about, if you could recognize the funder, perhaps on a basketball or something, are there any guidelines to what you can and can't do regarding sort of granting CRA rules, et cetera? Or where do you find those? Or real do's and don'ts on that side?
There aren't necessarily any CRA guidelines on that. Okay. We do have some information on the Parks Foundation website on our amateur sports page. We have put together a kind of a recognition application. So once somebody receives an amateur sport grant, they are asked to provide us back with a form back that kind of says what type of recognition they're providing. And, we get all kinds of creative ideas. So, there's not necessarily anything right or wrong. Can't think of anything that would be wrong off the top of my head, but yeah, be creative.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you, Sara and Sara. Really, really interesting and basic, but not basic. But again, it's simplifying something that's very intimidating. I encourage everybody, register or inquire, talk to us about April 22nd. If that can help you. And again, you can reach out to Sara Stepa. Thank you, both Saras. Thank you to the Parks Foundation. Thank you to Step Up Consulting for this. It's something that people could say, oh, it's very boring and dry, but it's very important. And, again, we want to get the money that is out there into the organizations to be able to have that impact. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. I want to remind everybody we will be sending information out, but on April 20th, we do have Sport Calgary's AGM. We will be having a great fireside chat with local Olympians and how they started in grassroots sport, went all the way to the Olympic podium. So it's going to be great. So look for that information. And again, if you have any questions about becoming a Sport Calgary member, which is free, you can reach out to us. So the link is in the chat on the workshop. So again, Sara, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for joining us, and have a great rest of your day and stay safe, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.